So this is going to be a heavier video because I'm going to share with you a racist encounter I had with a client that just happened yesterday. It's really fresh. I rarely talk about these types of experiences in a client context because they rarely happen. And I really gave thought about whether I should talk about this openly, but I'm going to, given that in this moment there is such a heightened, pronounced spotlight on anti-racism, and I think it's so important that we as professionals of color share our experiences that continue to happen in the context of racism. And in particular, I want to share this because it just shows you that how you can be a globally renowned expert on interrupting racism, and you can be hired by a client to come in to do work on fighting racism, and you can still be on the receiving end of white supremacy and of racism. So in a nutshell, in the thick of this moment where there is a spotlight on anti-racism, anti-Black racism, rightfully so, in particular, I have been getting calls from companies around the world to provide awareness building, learning opportunities as it relates to anti-racism and allyship in particular. And so I had a prominent financial company, a firm, reach out to me a few weeks ago to provide unconscious bias training, which they had never provided for their organization. And just over 2 weeks ago, I had a call with two of their C-suite leaders. So two C-suite leaders, executive leadership team. We had a conversation about how they'd never done training. They wanted to hire me to do unconscious bias training with a focus on racial bias in particular. Yesterday, I had this call with the two leaders again. I take note, my first call was by video. So it was by Zoom, they could see me. I had my second call yesterday, and during this call, the purpose was to talk about what do you want me to share and teach about in the unconscious bias webinar that I'm going to do for you next week with a focus on interrupting racial bias. I called into Zoom. It was going to be a second video call. I got onto the Zoom line and I could see the both of them, and I said, "Hi, how are you?" And the woman leader responded by saying, white woman leader, I should note, and he, by the way, the second leader, is a white male leader. The woman leader, white woman, responded by saying, "Hi, it's nice to meet you." And it was one of those moments where you're like I was stunned because I had just 2 weeks earlier had a call with her, and she had seen me. We had spent 30 minutes on a video call together. She had seen me the whole time. The few days before we had our call yesterday, we have been emailing back and forth, and so it's not like she's had no correspondence with me or never seen me. So I pointed out, well, actually, we've met before. We had a call a few weeks ago, and she said, "Oh," flustered, "Oh, sorry, I've seen one of your videos and I must have gotten confused." I had an extremely sinking feeling in that moment, and I could also feel very activated. I'll come back to this moment later. But our call started off on this very negative tone, and it spiraled downward from there on in, for me in particular. We shifted to talking about the purpose of the training. I'll spare you the details, but in a nutshell, I asked about why do you want to do this training? It's important to teach about inclusion. Great. I asked about, can you give me examples of bias that show up in your environment around racism, gender bias, sexual orientation, and more. And the response was, we have a very respectful company, and respect is our primary value, and everyone respects everyone. So when I asked about examples of bias, that was the response I got. I asked about diversity in leadership. There's no people of color in their senior leadership ranks. However, we do have other leaders who are of color. But the other thing that they said that just for me was like the straw that broke the camel's back is when I asked about what would you like me to talk about, what specific areas of bias would you like me to talk about, or is there anything else that you would like to tell me that I must teach? The response I got back was, from the white woman, "I would like you to teach about how people of color engage in racial bias as well." And so I was stunned again, and by this stage I was extremely activated, And I asked, could you explain what you mean by that, please? Because I was like, let me get this right, that they are hiring me to teach about inclusion, about interrupting racial bias. And I've asked, what do you want me to teach? And they have now said to me, we want you to teach people of color that they have racial biases. And she repeated, I would like you to talk about how people of color have racial biases. For example, Asian people like to hire only Asians. And we need to teach our people of color that everyone should be inclusive. Everyone needs to be inclusive. Because, of course, the real issue in corporations, especially in the financial sector, is that people of color are engaging in racial bias as opposed to white people. At this stage, I was very upset, and I had one of those moments where you are confronted with a activated experience, and do you actually want to work with a client who doesn't remember meeting you as a woman of color? And when you ask about why are you hiring me, it's that we respect everyone, but even though I forgot who you are, and meeting you, an expert in inclusion. And what should I teach as an inclusion expert? I should teach the people of color about how they engage in racial biases, because they want to hire their own people and not white people. Like, we shouldn't talk about white people and their racism. So I did something that's extremely powerful and important, and I have to say I'm so grateful that, given the work that I do, I knew what to do. I spoke truth to power, and in that moment I named my discomfort. I expressed that I felt extremely disrespected by her in particular, that she forgot who I am as a woman of color doing this work, that we had met and she did not remember meeting me, and that she was requesting that I focus in my unconscious bias webinar about how people of color engage in racial biases. So basically teach about reverse racism, and that it's us as people of color who need to really actually focus on being inclusive. I expressed my discomfort. I expressed that in that moment I did not know whether I could do this work. I needed to take a moment to settle and reflect on it and get back to them. They apologized, she in particular, expressed that they wanted to continue to work with me. They hoped that I would continue to do the webinar, and that was that. We ended the call. Oh, the one other thing I offered in that call is I said I would like to be able to debrief this call with you afterwards to let you know, once I'm settled, why this call has been so upsetting for me as a woman of color, and talk about how racial bias has also permeated this discussion. That's a really important point that I made. I got off the call, it took me a few hours, I settled down, and then ultimately I decided that I would get back to them and say I would do it. Why? Because I thought this was an important learning moment, that I, as a professional who's an expert in this space, could use this webinar opportunity to teach about racial bias, to raise leadership awareness, and I thought that was an important experience. And I would have been completely professional had I done it. I certainly would not have named the experience or spoken about it. I would have been professional in my delivery. Anyhow, they fired me. I got an email back in response to me saying, I'm good to do this, saying, upon reflection, we have decided we will not continue working with you. We will terminate our agreement. I think it's the right result, perfectly fine. But ultimately what this signals to me is this organization decided to fire me despite me saying I could do the job, and let's debrief this experience and so I can teach you about why, even in this conversation, in our working dynamic, racial bias is prevalent. They decided to fire me. And what it signals to me is that because I could not be controlled, that I, as a person of color who they had decided to hire to teach about racial bias, they could not get me to teach what they wanted me to teach, people of color engaging in racial bias as opposed to white people. They didn't want to work with me, so they discarded me. Powerful moment, powerful experience, painful experience, but let me tell you what it is about this experience in particular that I find to be so upsetting, because I think this is a learning moment for those of you watching, especially for those of you who are white. What bothered me most in this experience is that we as people of color, and I'm going to get emotional here because it just happened yesterday and I am upset. We as people of color, as professionals of color, myself, I have worked so hard for all of my credentials, my pedigree, all of my distinctions, my awards, my education, so that I can be taken seriously, so that I can be respected in my line of work. And I repeatedly have to re-audition for the role again and again and again to establish that despite all of my education, all my track record and more, that I am a credible person. I can't tell you how disrespectful, how invisible I feel as a woman of color when I have a call with someone who has reached out to me because they hear about my expertise, they meet me, they see me, and 2 weeks later when we're getting back on a call, say to me, "It's nice to meet you," and have forgotten that they have met me before. It makes me feel invisible as a person of color. It makes me feel as though I am unseen, and it reinforces how meaningless we are in moments as people of color, despite our efforts to be taken seriously. And that, out of everything, is what hurts me the most. The feeling of, despite how hard I work and how important it is for me to be seen and heard, that I continue to have moments professionally where, despite all of my successes, I am invisible to some. I continue to be invisible to some. And that, for me, is the most painful and hurtful part of all of this. And I suspect as I share this, that so many of you can identify with what I am saying, because this is what it feels like to be on the receiving end of racism. But it's also important that I'm sharing this with you today because it signifies as well the level of tokenism that exists in this moment, as some companies are reaching out to us who do EDI work, equity, diversity, inclusion work, saying that they want to offer training and awareness building, that it's actually acts of tokenism, because when the opportunity actually presents itself to really learn, the message we're getting is, could you teach people of color to not be racist towards white people because Asians want to hire Asians? The other reason why I'm sharing this, and I think this is so important, especially given my work that I do on interrupting the internalization of bias and healing from racial trauma experiences, is that I stood in my power in my discussion with her. In that moment, despite feeling extremely activated and upset, I knew how to stand in my power and to claim my power and assert myself. And I'm sure she has rarely, if not never, had a woman of color speak to her as I did. And I have to tell you, I feel so blessed, so grateful, and so proud of myself that I stood in my power. But I know how to do this because I do the heavy work of learning how to interrupt the internalization of bias. I work very hard at decolonizing my heart and mind. I work very hard at healing my racial trauma. And I wanted to share this with you who are watching today, those of you who identify as being Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that we, in doing our work, can learn to stand in our power. And when we have these moments, interrupt the experience so that we leave the experience feeling like, good for you, you claimed your power, you stood in your power, and you called out the racism that you are directly and overtly experiencing. And so my hope is that in sharing this with you, that it empowers you to do the same. I talk a lot about this across Instagram on my videos, or you can go to ritubhasin.com. I have so many videos and blogs there about how you can learn to do this as well. I hope that this has helped you in some way. It certainly helps me to share. I find sharing to be really healing. Thank you for supporting the work that I do, and thank you for making me feel seen, because as you can see, there are moments when I certainly don't. Thank you.